My name is Dara Osei. I am 30 years old. And the Friday evening, a courier knocked on my parents' front door during dessert and handed me a letter. That was the evening I finally understood that the most reliable witness to your work is the work itself, and that it will speak when it is ready whether or not anyone at the table has been listening. My mother had set down her fork 40 seconds before the knock. She had been making a point. This little app of yours is an embarrassment, Dara. Real engineers build things people actually use. My father, who was at the head of the table with his reading glasses still on from something he had been reviewing before dinner and had not removed, did not look up from his plate. He had a way of registering disagreement through the quality of his silence. Not agreement, not defense, simply a withdrawal of presence that left the room to whoever was speaking. My brother Kofi, who was 27 and had spent the last 3 years watching me work on something he did not understand and had concluded, from the duration alone, that its failure was inevitable, laughed once and said, "She's been saying this for 3 years. Meaning my mother, meaning the criticism, meaning the whole accumulated weight of a verdict that had been delivered in installments since the first evening I had mentioned, at this same table, that I was building something on the side." I picked up my water glass and took a sip. Something in me had learned over 3 years of Friday dinners at that table, that the moment a room has made its decision about you is the exact moment that responding to it becomes the least useful thing you can do. The decision had been made. The room had spoken. What was already in motion was in motion regardless of what happened next at this table. What none of them knew, what I had told no one in that house, not that evening, not any evening, was that 3 days earlier I had received a phone call from a man named James Okafor, who was the head of corporate development at a software company whose name I will not state directly, but whose productivity platform my father used every morning and my brother had on his laptop, and my mother's hospital system had licensed for their administrative staff for the past 4 years. James had told me that his team had completed their technical review of Vector, which was the name of what my mother had just called an embarrassment. He had told me they wanted to move to a formal offer. He had told me the offer letter would be sent by courier to the address I had provided, which was my parents' house, because I had been staying there for 2 months while my apartment was being renovated, and because I had not thought, when I provided the address 6 weeks earlier during the preliminary conversations, that the timing would land quite the way it was about to land. The knock came while my mother was still at the table. I want to tell you about Vector, and about the 3 years that preceded that Friday evening, because the story only holds its weight if you understand what was actually in the envelope. I had trained as a software engineer. My undergraduate degree was in computer science from a university I will not name but which my parents had considered at the time of my admission the most significant event in our family's recent history. My father had called his own father that evening, which was a call he made perhaps 4 times a year, to report it. I had graduated, taken a position at a mid-size enterprise software firm, and spent 4 years writing back-end infrastructure code for a platform that managed workflow automation for corporate clients. The work was competent and well-compensated, and by the end of the 4th year, deeply familiar in the way that things become when you have done them long enough to understand not just how they work, but exactly where they stop being interesting. What had stopped being interesting, specifically, was the problem the platform was designed to solve. Workflow automation, the routing of tasks, approvals, documents, notifications through an organization's operational structure, was a solved problem in the sense that many companies had built systems that did it. What was not solved, or not solved well, was the diagnostic layer underneath, the question of which workflows in a given organization were actually creating friction rather than reducing it. Most workflow automation platforms, including the one I worked on, were built on the assumption that if you automated a process, you improved it. This was true in the sense that automation removed manual steps. It was not true in the sense that automated bad processes were still bad processes, now running faster and producing bad outputs at higher volume. I had watched this happen at 3 of our clients in the space of 18 months. Each of them had implemented the platform correctly, according to spec, and each of them had seen measurable increases in process speed accompanied by no measurable improvement in outcomes, because the processes they had automated were structurally flawed in ways the automation had preserved rather than corrected. The problem was not the platform. The problem was that nobody had a tool for finding the structural flaws before they were encoded into the automation. I began building Vector in the evenings of my 4th year at the firm. The concept was a pre-automation diagnostic layer, a system that mapped an organization's existing processes, identified the specific friction points within them, and produced a prioritized remediation report before any automation was applied. It was not a workflow automation platform. It was the thing that should happen before a workflow automation platform is deployed, and which almost never did because there was nothing to run it on. The technical build was the part one knew how to do. The harder part was the validation layer, developing a methodology for identifying structural friction that was rigorous enough to produce reliable outputs across different organizational types and scales. I spent 8 months on that problem alone, evenings and weekend mornings, building a framework I called the Process Integrity Index, which rated each step in a workflow against 7 parameters I had derived from the 3 client failure cases and a literature review of organizational process theory that I conducted across 41 academic papers over 6 months. I was not an organizational theorist. I read carefully, and I documented what I understood, and I had every element of the framework reviewed by a professor of operations management named Dr. Anita Carvalho, who I had contacted through a professional network and who had agreed, after reading my methodology document, to provide a paid review. She sent back 17 pages of notes. I revised the framework twice before she told me it was structurally sound. I left the firm at the end of my 4th year. Not dramatically. I gave standard notice, completed my handover, and left on good terms with a manager named Philip Asare, who told me in my exit meeting that he thought I was making a mistake and that he hoped I would reconsider. I told him I appreciated the 3 years of mentorship and that I had thought about it carefully. We shook hands. I started working on Vector full-time the following Monday. I had moved back to my parents' house 6 months into that period, not because the work was failing, but because the runway mathematics of building a loan without revenue had led me to a straightforward conclusion. I could extend my runway by 18 months by reducing my fixed costs to near zero, which meant not paying rent. My parents had agreed, without significant discussion. My mother had made the agreement contingent on a timeline which she had stated as 1 year, and which had become a point of recurring reference at the Friday dinners as the year extended first to 18 months, and then to 2 years, and then to the 3 years that had accumulated by the Friday of the envelope. I want to be precise about my mother's position because she deserves the precision. Her name is Adwoa Osei. She is 58 years old. She spent 31 years as a hospital administrator, most of them in operational roles managing budgets, staffing, and facility logistics for a large regional medical center. She understood organizations and she understood process, and what she understood about software was that successful software companies were funded, scaled, and visible, and that what I was doing was none of those things. Her framework for professional legitimacy was institutional, credentials, employers, capital structures, she could name. Vector was a solo project with no funding, no employer, no capital structure, and a founder who had been living in the back bedroom for 2.5 years. From inside her framework, the verdict was reasonable. My father, Emmanuel Osei, was a civil engineer, retired for 3 years. He was a quieter character than my mother in most respects, but held his own strong view about what constituted serious professional work, a view shaped by 40 years of project-based practice in which a thing was real when it was built, certified, and standing. Software that had not shipped to paying clients was not yet standing. He had not said this explicitly. He did not need to. The reading glasses that stayed on during dinner were their own kind of statement. Kofi was my younger brother by 3 years, working in financial services, and his laugh at the Friday table was the laugh of a man who had watched an older sibling take a risk he himself would not have taken and had been waiting, not unkindly, for the outcome to confirm his judgment. He was not wrong that the waiting had been long. He was wrong about what the waiting meant. Vector had, by the Friday of the envelope, 7 paying enterprise clients. I want to be specific about that number because it matters to the shape of the story. Not 70. Not 700. 7. The revenue from those 7 clients totaled $1.87 million in annual contract value, a figure that reflected pricing I had set with the help of a sales strategy consultant named Miriam Teta, who had spent 15 years in enterprise software sales and who had told me, when she first reviewed my client list and contract terms, that I was underpriced by a factor that she considered professionally uncomfortable to observe. I had raised the pricing on the subsequent 2 client engagements. The 7 clients had come through 3 channels: 2 through a referral from Dr. Carvalho, whose academic network included several operations executives who had read a paper she had co-authored drawing on the Process Integrity Index framework. 2 through a case study I had published on a professional forum documenting the methodology and its outcomes at my first client, which had been a mid-sized logistics company whose process audit had identified $340,000 in annual operational waste in their procurement approval chain. And 3 through a direct outreach campaign that Miriam had helped me design and that I had run over 4 months, targeting operations and transformation leads at companies in the $50 million to $500 million revenue range. The 7th client, the one who had generated the conversation that led to James Okafor's phone call, was a professional services firm that had implemented the diagnostic methodology across their project delivery workflows and had documented a measurable improvement in project completion rates that their managing director had described, in writing, in a client reference letter, as the most significant operational improvement this firm has seen in 11 years. That reference letter had been forwarded by the managing director to a contact of his at the software company whose logo was on the envelope. The contact had forwarded it internally. It had reached James Okafor's desk. James's team had spent 6 weeks on their technical review before he called me. I had answered questions from 3 of their engineers over 2 separate sessions, provided full access to the Process Integrity Index documentation, and walked their product team through the methodology in a 90-minute call that had ended with the product lead asking whether the framework was patent pending. I had told her it was, which was true. The patent application had been filed 7 months earlier by a patent attorney named Kwame Asani, who had reviewed the methodology documentation and filed on the process innovation elements. The offer letter that was on its way to my parents' house contained a proposed acquisition figure. I will not state the full figure in this account. It belongs in a different part of the story. What I will tell you is that the stated consideration for the vector technology, methodology, and patent portfolio was $6.3 million, with a separate employment arrangement for a 2-year integration period. The courier knocked on the door at 8:22 p.m. on a Friday, while my mother's fork was still on the table. My father answered the door. He was closer to the hallway than I was, and he rose from the table in the unhurried way he rose from tables, and I heard him open the front door and exchange a few words with someone outside. Then I heard him say my name, not called out, simply said, in the tone he used when something required my attention. I went to the hallway. The courier was a young man in a dark jacket holding an envelope in both hands. The envelope was standard letter size, cream-colored, with a printed label bearing my name and the address, and in the upper left corner, the company logo, the specific shade of blue, the particular typographic weight, that I had been looking at on my father's laptop screen and my brother's desktop, and my mother's hospital system login page for the past 4 years. I signed for it. The courier left. My father looked at the envelope without saying anything. In the particular way he looked at structural specifications when he was reading the load, assessing, not yet concluded. I carried the envelope back to the dining room. My mother had not moved. Kofi had his water glass halfway to his mouth. I set the envelope on the table beside my plate, sat down, and picked up my fork. My mother looked at the logo. Her fork, which she had set down to make her point 40 seconds before the knock, remained on the table.
"What is that?" she said.
Not a question with a rising inflection. A statement issued in the form of a question, which was how she issued most things that required an answer she was not sure she wanted. "A letter," I said. "From them." "Yes." A silence settled over the table that was different in texture from the silences that had preceded it. Kofi set his water glass down without drinking. My father, who had returned to his chair, removed his reading glasses and set them beside his plate, which was a thing he did only when the situation required his full attention. I opened the envelope. I read the first 2 paragraphs, which were the material ones. I set the letter face down on the table. "It's an offer," I said, "to acquire Vector." My mother's chair did not scrape. She did not stand. She sat very still in the way she sat when she was processing information that required restructuring of existing categories, the particular stillness of a woman who had spent 31 years absorbing unexpected operational information and had learned to hold it without visible response until she had somewhere to put it. "How much?" she said. I told her the figure. The body of this account will not repeat it because the figure belongs to the moment, not to the retelling. What I will tell you is that the number had a specific weight when it landed in that room, and that the weight was not in the digits but in the 3 years they represented, the evenings, the revisions, the 17 pages from Dr. Carvalho, the Miriam Teta pricing conversation, the 7 clients, the managing director's 11-year letter. Kofi put his water glass down on the tablecloth rather than the coaster.
He looked at it. Then he looked at me.
Then he looked at the letter face down on the table. My father picked up his reading glasses. He put them back on. He looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way he looked at structural calculations he was running internally, not absence, active computation. Is Kwame Asante your attorney on this? He said. Patent filing only, I said. I'll need a transaction attorney for the acquisition. I have a name. He nodded once.
Good.
My mother had not moved. Her fork was still beside her plate, where she had set it down to make her point. She looked at the envelope. She looked at me. Something in the set of her shoulders, not collapse, not softening, something more structural than either of those, shifted by approximately 2 degrees. She picked up her fork. She did not say anything. She did not offer a revision of the verdict she had delivered 47 minutes earlier. She picked up her fork and resumed her dinner, and the table resumed around her, and the letter sat face down between my plate and my water glass for the rest of the meal. That was all. That was the whole of it. The room did not erupt. No one wept. No one delivered a speech. The courier knocked, the letter arrived, the number was stated, and my mother picked up her fork. That is, in my experience, what vindication actually looks like. Not a thunderclap. A fork picked up. The transaction attorney I had the name for was a woman named Beatrice Carty, who specialized in technology acquisitions and whose name I had been given by Miriam Teta 8 months earlier, on the principle, as Miriam had put it, that you find the attorney before you need the attorney, so that when you need the attorney you are not finding her under time pressure. I called Beatrice the following Monday morning. She had already heard of Vector. Not the company specifically, but the case study I had published on the professional forum, which had apparently circulated in some of the circles she moved in. She asked 3 sharp questions and told me she could start the following week. The negotiation took 9 weeks. I will not detail every exchange. Beatrice's function in this account is structural, not dramatic. What I will tell you is that she pushed back on 2 elements of the initial offer and secured modifications to both, and that the final transaction closed on a Thursday afternoon in her office, which had a view of a street I had walked down many times on the way to the professional development courses I had taken in my 2nd year of building Vector, before I knew where the building would end up. I drove home from Beatrice's office on the Thursday and parked in my parents' driveway, because I was still at their house while the apartment renovation concluded. I sat in the car for a few minutes. Not in ceremony. The day had been long, and there was something specific about sitting still in a parked car after a long day that I had found, over the preceding years, to be the most efficient form of decompression available. Then I went inside. My mother was in the kitchen. I told her the transaction had closed. She asked if I was hungry. I said I could eat. She made eggs and we sat at the kitchen table, not the dining room, the kitchen table, which was a different register entirely, the table for ordinary evenings, and she asked 3 questions about what the next 2 years would look like, the integration period, where I would be based, whether I had negotiated the terms carefully. I answered each one. She listened in the way she listened when she was updating a file rather than building a case. At the end of the meal, she said, "Kwame did good work on the patent." I said, "He did." She cleared the plates. I helped. We did not discuss the Friday dinner, or the fork, or the 3 years. There was nothing to discuss that the Thursday had not already settled. Kofi came by the following Saturday. Not a planned visit, he texted 20 minutes before and asked if I was around. I was in the back bedroom, which I had been using as a workspace for 2 years, packing the last of the equipment in preparation for the move back to my apartment. He stood in the doorway the way people stand in doorways when they have something to say and are deciding how to say it. "The case study," he said. "The one you published." I read it. I was wrapping a monitor cable. When? 2 months ago. After Mum mentioned the client number.
He paused.
I didn't tell you I'd read it. I know. The methodology is real. I could see that it was real. I set the cable in the box. I know. I should have looked earlier. I thought about that for a moment. Not the apology specifically, the structure of it, the thing it was trying to address. 3 years was a long time to have watched something without looking at it. The not looking was its own kind of statement, made in installments, the same way my mother's verdict had been. You looked, I said. That matters. He was quiet. Then, where are you based for the integration period?
Here.
Their regional office is 20 minutes away. He nodded. Okay. He picked up one of the smaller boxes from the floor without being asked and carried it to the hallway. I heard him set it down by the front door. We loaded 3 boxes into my car in the kind of quiet that does not require filling. When we were done, he said he would come by the new apartment when it was set up. I said I would text him. He drove away. I went back inside to finish packing the workspace that had been, for 2 years, the place where the work happened, the place the Friday dinners had been unable to see because the visibility had not been the point. The transaction closed. The apartment renovation finished. I moved back. The integration work started on a Monday morning in a building 20 minutes from my parent house, in a team that included 2 engineers I had worked with at my old firm, a product manager named Celicy Brew, who had joined Vector 6 months before the acquisition as a fractional advisor and who transitioned to the integration team, and a documentation specialist named Priya Menon, whose task was to translate the Process Integrity Index framework into a format compatible with the acquiring company's existing product architecture. Priya finished the first translation draft in 11 weeks. The lead engineer on the integration team, a man named David Hartley, told me it was the most clearly documented methodology he had seen transferred in an acquisition in his 12 years of integration work. I thanked him and asked what the second clearest had been, because the comparison was useful information. He laughed and named a company. I filed the information and went back to the review. The work was what it had always been. Different room, same requirement. Read the process, find the friction, document the finding, and trust that a clear output is its own argument. I kept the envelope, not displayed, in the bottom of a document box that also contains the patent filing, the original Process Integrity Index methodology document, and the 17 pages of notes from Dr. Carvalho. I kept it because it is a record of the specific sequence. My mother's fork on the table, the knock, the courier, the logo, the weight of the figure in that room. Not to revisit it. Not as a trophy. As a document of the interval between the moment a room has decided about you and the moment the work arrives to offer a different account. That interval is where the building happens. Every hour of it. The work does not ask permission to be real. It asks only that you continue. If a room full of people who knew you before you knew yourself has ever told you to stop, and you didn't stop, then you already understand what that envelope weighed. When my mother picked up her fork on that Friday, she was not conceding the argument. She was encountering the evidence. The 2 things look identical from across the table. They are not the same. Here's what I want to ask you. When the courier knocked on that door, 30 seconds after my mother said the words, "Real engineers build things people actually use," was that timing a coincidence or the kind of thing that only feels like coincidence because we are not usually watching closely enough when it happens? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If you have ever kept building while someone at the table called it embarrassing, subscribe. There's a new story every week, and every one of them begins the same way, with a room that has not yet seen what is already in the mail.